Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And yes, I'm in another hotel room, and we're going to be talking about a couple more albums on the docket today. Currently, I'm in Liverpool. Hotel room is small. Again, there might be a little bit of echo. That's what happens. But hey, going off, we got 3 specific albums, all associated with women in rock this time. So let's start off with something a little bit earlier that I probably should have gotten to. So I feel like some of the buzz for Bleached has faded a little bit, just in terms of the album coming and then going fairly quickly, especially as it seems like it's come a couple of years after they really hit some stride with their brand of power pop and retro throwback veneer and slight hints of punk and surf rock. But going into this album here, I was actually pleasantly surprised how much it worked, and then kind of went for me. And honestly, I was planning on putting it on the trailing edge. I just didn't think I had enough material. But going into it again, going off the trip, I was struck by how many of the hooks really came through. There's a lot of phenomenal guitar and bass interplay, even if some of the synths are not always the best integrated, but at the same time, there's a fuzzed out rawness to a lot of the sound that I really genuinely do appreciate. And I think the front woman has a lot of presence as a singer. Although the funny thing about this album is that it does have a very 90s quality to it. There's a certain amount of detached irony that comes through having seen as much shit as it's very clear that our front woman has, and you can tell that she's trying not to take everything all too seriously, or even what level of irony she's fully capable of operating on, especially as you can tell that there's been some drug and alcohol abuse in the past, and that definitely does color a lot of the writing on this album. But at the same time, there is still a desire for genuine human emotion going throughout the entire thing, and that lends the album a ton of character. And going back to a lot of the hooks, they stick with me. There is actually some genuine quality here. Now, the album's not perfect. I still think in terms of wearing a lot of the influences on their sleeve, that is a little bit of an issue for Bleached. Not all the hooks quite land as strongly as you would like, and yeah, there are some production issues where you wish that there was a little bit more scuzz or edge. I think part of this comes in some of the retro throwback vibe. If they stuck a little bit outside that comfort zone, I think the power pop they would bring forward would be a lot more tight and interesting. But yeah, this actually came around on me. Good stuff. 7 out of 10. Check it out.
Start to feel crazy. I get up and wonder how we got here. I look at you, fog starts to clear.
And while we are on the subject of retro throwback leaning acts, we have The Regrets. Now, this is a band I was originally put on to by the rock critic, aka Crash Thompson, as being more of a pretty classically inclined, not quite Riot Girl, not quite pure punk rock band, with a certain backward-looking flourish that you can clearly show has its debts to some of 70s punk, some 70s pop punk as well, a little bit of college rock, a little bit of 90s rock in there as well. And overall, it's kind of meat and potato stuff for these sort of relationship songs. I do think that there's some decent amount of nuance there, so I actually did appreciate a lot of what we got. And then we got a new album, and I hate to say it, it just feels like a lot more of the same. I do like a lot of the emotional nuance that comes through in the lyrics, and that there is some genuine yearning in comparison with an act like Bleached, where it's very clear that the front woman has just been through shit. You get similar notes of emotional intelligence that comes through on this particular album from The Regrets, but a little bit more naivete and kind of leaning into it a little bit more, which is working, but it also means that some of the songs can start to run together and you realize, okay, if you think a couple of these situations through a little bit more cleanly, you might not be as heartbroken when they all inevitably go awry. I think probably my larger issue might come down to some of the production and compositions. The bass lines and the percussion are not crazy innovative, and by leaning more into the retro styles, the album isn't quite as furious or jagged as their debut, which does be a little bit more of a setback. And especially when you have 15 songs, the album does run a little long and can feel a bit repetitive at spots. Still, if you're into the sort of retro girl group throwback that has links to punk and 90s rock, you can do a lot worse than The Regrets, which is why I'm giving this a strong 6 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious. But now on to the big issue, the matter at hand. What, you expect me to do the same thing I did for Slipknot to Sleater-Kinney? Well, I think there would be a lot of people who would expect me to, and honestly, I'm not entirely surprised. Sleater-Kinney's been getting a lot of backlash for this album, and it's not as if I don't see why, but I also think that a little bit of it is undeserved, and it does mean this is a bit more of a complicated conversation than I wanted to reserve for a usual vacation review, which is normally a little bit shorter. But just to provide some context, this is the newest album from Sleater-Kinney after the past 4 years, and let me start off right out of the gate. I'm not that surprised by the progression in sound. The big producer this time around is Annie Clark, aka St. Vincent. You kind of have an idea of what her sound is going to come through as like, even though she's not working with John Congleton this time around, so there might be some differentiating factor. Off topic. But the other thing is that going back to No Cities to Love, it's important to highlight how much that sound was going in a slightly more accessible, maybe even a pop direction. So to see Sleater-Kinney continue down slightly of that path, it's not all that surprising. Unless they're gonna go pure metal or get even harder or even rougher, as I think some people wanted them to do. They kind of exhausted a lot of similar templates going down that sound. This is probably one of the few avenues that remain open to them that sound distinctive while still sounding like mostly a Sleater-Kinney album. But at the same time, I get why people are calling this one of the weaker Sleater-Kinney albums, and I'm not hesitant to disagree with that. For one, I actually totally understand why Janet Weiss left the band as their drummer, because a lot of the percussion sections are really stiff, really regimented. There isn't that same vibrancy and potency that comes out of the low end and some of the driving beats. And some of the grooves are, for an album that's trying to lean into its groove, they're not entirely impressive. More to the point, if you know St. Vincent's style of production, specifically around the guitar segments, that's also very much here. So this album is a little bit more regimented and blocky with its guitar progressions and its distortion, which can be fine if you like St. Vincent, but it's not quite the same wild, really outgoing, organic sense of energy that made Sleater-Kinney so effective. And I'm not always sure it really complements Carrie Brownstein's delivery, at least not as much as I want it to. Now, that being said, I do think this album is getting a little bit too much hatred, mostly because I actually think some of the grooves are pretty promising. And while this album does really take a while to get going, a couple of the songs on the back half that actually bring a little bit more of that fervent energy, like Bad Dance and Love, I think they're really promising. And Sleater-Kinney has always had a gift for writing really good hooks. More to the point, I actually quite like a lot of the lyrics here. Yeah, they're a little bit more sexually ribald that you would expect coming from Carrie Brownstein, but she's very much aware that that is part of the provocation in and of itself. Women of her age and in her position, they aren't technically supposed to get as provocative in this lane. Everyone wanted her to make the high energy, furious political album, but she's also smart enough to realize that in today's climate, where there is a gradual push towards conservatism and a sexual brand of repression that comes along with that sort of abstract patriarchy, being more sexually in your face, being aware that the center cannot hold, being willing to push that bad dance to the forefront while still maintaining the emotional honesty to end the album with songs like Broken, where she feels that leveling sense of empathy. That's powerful stuff. I actually think that there's a lot going on there in terms of sexual dynamics and emotional dynamics that are more open, that highlight modern alienation. They feel updated without feeling like it's going into the very obvious blame technology for everything, which I appreciate. And I like that there is the level of emotional honesty and nuance there that actually does kind of make sense with the production, being more regimented and mechanical in spots. Now look, I am a Sleater-Kinney fan, and I went back to revisit the highlights of all of their albums before covering this. So if you're gonna come here and say that it's their worst album, it's hard for me to outright disagree, because there are problems here. I'm not crazy about all the grooves. I'm not crazy about all the hooks either. It's definitely one of their more uneven projects, and if you want to call it their worst, I would say that. I would understand. But I'm not sure I would specifically call this a bad album, though. I think the highlights are there. I think the writing is there. where I think once you become accustomed to the sound and the blending of some of the synthesizers and some of the more alien tones, and able to worm your way into that mindset, I think there's a lot of promise. And I think that there is some nuance that's getting overshadowed because I think people had an expectation of what they wanted from a Sleater-Kinney project that this defiantly is not. As such, for me, I'm thinking a 7 out of 10. It's recommended. Be prepared for a shift if you're coming from other Sleater-Kinney projects, because this is definitely different, but I dig it. I think this is actually pretty good. Check it out.